5 years earlier, inside an upscale Chicago restaurant, Amelia stared at Caleb, a single father in a worn coat, and coldly announced that she would only marry a billionaire. The whole table laughed. Caleb said nothing. He simply bent down, picked up the wallet she had dropped, set it beside her plate, and walked out into the night. Nobody at that table knew he would lose everything before sunrise, and that the same night would mark the beginning of an empire. 5 years later, Amelia walked into a job interview and froze, seeing Caleb seated in the chief executive's chair. Stay with this story, because that arrogant sentence from years ago will cost her far more than she ever imagined. The restaurant sat on the 22nd floor of a glass tower overlooking Lake Michigan, the kind of place where the tablecloths cost more than most people's rent. Amelia had arrived early for the birthday dinner of a friend from her investment firm, wearing a dress she had saved 3 months to afford, determined to look like she belonged among the women with rings the size of ice cubes, and men who talked about yachts the way other people talked about weather. She had grown up watching her mother count coins at a kitchen table, and she had promised herself long ago that she would never again live that way, that wealth would be the wall between her and the fear she carried since childhood. Jackson arrived a few minutes later with a guest nobody had been expecting, a quiet man named Caleb, who wore a coat that had clearly been pressed and cared for, but was years past its prime. Jackson introduced him as an old friend, someone sharp with numbers who just needed the right introduction to the right people, and for a moment, the table extended the kind of polite curiosity reserved for strangers who might turn out to be interesting. Caleb sat at the edge of the group, listening more than speaking, answering questions with a calm that some at the table mistook for dullness rather than restraint. When someone asked what he did for work, he said he handled logistics for a warehouse, that he was also raising his child alone, and that most nights were long. The table's warmth cooled by degrees, the way a room does when someone admits they are not one of the winners. Amelia watched him with the particular disdain of someone who had fought hard to escape a life like his, and did not want to be reminded it existed. A man near the end of the table, half joking, said that Caleb and Amelia looked like they might make a good match. The quiet provider and the ambitious climber, and the table laughed the easy laugh of people who think the joke costs nothing. Amelia did not laugh along. She set down her glass, looked directly at Caleb, and said, in a voice pitched just loud enough for everyone to hear, that she would only ever marry a billionaire, that she had not spent her whole life clawing her way out of nothing just to end up back there, with a man who worked warehouse shifts and raised a child on food stamps and borrowed time. The table erupted into laughter, some out of genuine amusement, some out of relief that the joke had landed on someone else. Caleb's face did not change. He did not argue, did not defend himself, did not remind them that dignity does not require a bank statement. He simply reached down, picked up the wallet that had slipped from Amelia's purse and landed near his foot, and placed it gently back on the table beside her plate. Then he stood, buttoned his coat, thanked Jackson for the invitation in a voice that carried no bitterness, and walked toward the door. Nobody at the table called after him. A waiter passing by offered a small, uncertain nod, the only gesture of sympathy Caleb received on his way out, and even that felt more like discomfort than kindness. Amelia watched him go with the satisfaction of someone who believed she had simply spoken an obvious truth, unaware that the words would follow her for the next 5 years like a debt coming due. The restaurant's warm light spilled onto the street as the door closed behind him, and for a moment the city noise swallowed him whole. An unremarkable man in a worn coat disappearing into a Chicago evening, carrying humiliation on his shoulders like a coat he had not chosen to wear. Behind him, laughter continued to drift through the glass, muffled now, already fading into the ordinary background noise of a city that had not paused for even a second to notice one man's quiet exit. He did not look back. Looking back, he had already learned, rarely changed what waited ahead, and he had a long walk home to think about exactly what he intended to do next. Caleb walked home in the rain because his car had broken down 2 weeks earlier, and there was no money left to fix it. The water soaked through his shoes with every step, but he barely noticed, his mind replaying the sound of laughter around that table, the particular way humiliation settles into a person's chest and refuses to leave. Halfway home, his phone buzzed with a message he had been waiting on for a week. A reply from the last job he had pinned his hopes on, a stable position that would have meant steady hours and health coverage for his child. The message was short and final, a polite rejection dressed up in corporate language, and Caleb stood under a streetlight reading it twice, as if the words might change on a second pass. Jackson called an hour later, his voice too light, too careful, offering an apology that sounded more like damage control than remorse. He said he hoped there were no hard feelings about the dinner, that Amelia could be blunt sometimes, that he just did not want things to be awkward going forward. Caleb understood immediately what the call really was. Jackson was not worried about him. Jackson was worried about being associated with him, about the stain of having brought an unemployed single father into a room full of people who mattered. Caleb said everything was fine and hung up, feeling the particular loneliness of realizing a friendship had never been built on anything solid at all. Back in his small apartment, he sat at the kitchen table surrounded by unpaid bills stacked in a neat, hopeless pile, the kind of order a person keeps when chaos feels like it might swallow them otherwise. He thought about the years he had spent telling himself that patience and hard work would eventually be seen, that someone would eventually notice the extra hours, the ideas he kept to himself because nobody had ever asked. He opened a drawer and pulled out an old notebook, its cover soft from handling, filled with sketches and notes for a logistics platform he had dreamed up years earlier, a system that could help small businesses move goods faster and cheaper than the giants that dominated the industry. He had abandoned the idea more than once, telling himself he lacked the capital, the connections, the commercial credentials that rooms like the one he had just left seemed to require before they would listen to a man like him. Every time he had shelved the notebook, it had been for a reason that sounded practical at the time, and every time some part of him had known the real reason was fear, the quiet certainty that trying and failing publicly would hurt more than never trying at all. That night, something shifted. Amelia's words had been a blade, but somewhere in the pain of them a different feeling was rising, something colder and steadier than anger. It was not a desire for revenge, not exactly, but something closer to clarity, the sudden understanding that waiting for the world's approval had cost him more years than the world itself had ever cost him. Caleb decided, sitting there with rain still dripping from his sleeves onto the notebook pages, that he was done waiting for permission from people who would never give it. He thought, too, of the quiet responsibility that shaped every decision he made, the understanding that whatever path he chose next would ripple beyond himself alone, and that thought steadied him rather than frightened him. If the world would not hand him respect, he would build something so undeniable that respect would have no choice but to arrive on its own terms, in its own time, without him ever having to ask for it again. Caleb took the only job available on short notice, a night shift at a distribution warehouse on the edge of the city, loading trucks under buzzing fluorescent lights while most of Chicago slept. The work was repetitive and exhausting, but it gave him something few other jobs had, a close view of exactly how much money a company could waste, through inefficient routing and careless scheduling. Within a month, he had noticed patterns nobody else seemed to see, trucks doubling back across the same routes, drivers waiting idle for hours because of poor coordination between departments, a system bleeding money in ways that added up to hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. He wrote up his observations by hand one night during a break, sketching out a simple reorganization of delivery zones and shift timing that could cut waste dramatically. He gave the pages to his shift supervisor, who barely glanced at them before setting them aside, more interested in finishing his coffee than reading proposals from a warehouse worker. The notes might have ended up in the trash if not for Eleanor, a semi-retired business consultant brought in that week to review the facility's operations for corporate. She found the pages by accident, tucked into a folder of unrelated paperwork, and something about the clarity of the handwriting made her read the whole thing twice. Eleanor had spent 3 decades advising executives who often knew far less about their own operations than the people quietly doing the work beneath them. She recognized in those handwritten pages a kind of instinct that could not be taught in business school. A mind that saw systems the way a mechanic hears an engine, picking out the exact place where something was grinding against itself. She asked around and found out the notes belonged to a warehouse loader named Caleb, and she requested a short meeting with him the following afternoon, more out of curiosity than obligation. Over coffee in a nearly empty diner near the warehouse, Eleanor asked him directly why a mind like his was spending its nights loading pallets instead of running a company. Caleb did not offer excuses or self-pity. He simply told her the truth: that opportunity rarely knocks for people who look like him, or come from where he came from, that he had learned long ago the value of quiet persistence because loud ambition had never once been rewarded. Eleanor nodded slowly, recognizing the particular exhaustion in his voice, the kind that came not from physical labor alone but from years of being overlooked despite consistent effort. She told him about her own early career, decades earlier, when she too had been dismissed in rooms that mattered simply because of how she looked and where she had come from, and how she had promised herself that if she ever had the standing to notice someone, the way nobody had noticed her, she would not let the moment pass quietly. Eleanor listened, and by the time their coffee had gone cold, she made him an offer that surprised them both: to mentor him personally in building a real business plan around the ideas scattered through that notebook. It was not charity, she told him plainly. It was recognition, the kind too many people like him rarely receive until it is too late to matter, and Caleb accepted with the wary gratitude of a man who had learned not to trust good fortune until it proved itself real. While Caleb worked nights and studied business fundamentals with Eleanor on his days off, Amelia continued climbing the only ladder she trusted, the one built from proximity to money and status. She had taken an analyst position at an investment firm downtown, a job that paid well but demanded she spend as much energy managing appearances as managing numbers. She surrounded herself with people who had inherited comfort rather than earned it, believing that closeness to wealth might eventually rub off on her the way heat spreads from one object to another simply through contact. Amelia was not a villain born from nothing. She had grown up in a household where the electricity sometimes got shut off at the end of hard months, where her mother worked 2 jobs and still could not always make rent, and where the shame of poverty had etched itself into her long before she understood there might be other paths through life. She had decided early that money was not simply comfort but armor, a wall thick enough that nothing from her childhood could ever reach her again. That decision, reasonable as its origins were, hardened over the years into something colder: a habit of measuring every person's worth by the size of their bank account rather than the size of their character. She began seeing Jackson not long after the dinner where Caleb had walked out into the rain, drawn to his easy confidence and his talk of deals and connections that always seemed to be one signature away from making him rich. Jackson worked in finance himself, though his actual success rested more on borrowed credibility and flattering the right people than on any real skill, a fact Amelia did not yet see clearly. He promised to introduce her to circles she had always wanted to enter: private clubs, exclusive fundraisers, rooms where the real decisions of the city were made over expensive wine. For a while it seemed to be working. Amelia attended dinners and openings on Jackson's arm, collecting the kind of social capital she believed would eventually convert into the life she had always wanted. She learned to speak the language of that world fluently: which restaurants mattered and which did not, which names were worth remembering and which could be safely forgotten the moment they stopped being useful, and she told herself this fluency was progress rather than a slow erosion of something she had once possessed and barely noticed slipping away. She rarely thought of Caleb during this period, and when she did, it was only as a distant, faintly embarrassing memory, a man from a dinner she had mostly forgotten, someone whose life had nothing further to do with her own. Occasionally, a flicker of guilt would surface, quickly buried beneath the reassurance that she had only spoken an honest truth that evening, that the discomfort belonged to him and not to her. She had no way of knowing that while she chased the appearance of success, a quiet man she had once dismissed without a second thought was laying, brick by careful brick, the actual foundation of it in a rented office across town. Caleb's first office was a single windowless room above a laundromat, furnished with a folding table, 2 chairs, and a second-hand computer that took nearly 10 minutes to start up each morning. Eleanor had helped him refine his notebook sketches into an actual business plan, a software platform designed to help small and mid-sized companies optimize their delivery routes and warehouse scheduling at a fraction of what the larger logistics giants charged. It was not a flashy idea, but it solved a real problem. The same problem Caleb had watched drain money from the warehouse where he had once worked the night shift. His first clients were skeptical, small business owners who took one look at his modest office and his lack of a business degree and wondered whether he could possibly deliver what he promised. Caleb answered every doubt with results instead of arguments. He offered his first client, a struggling regional delivery company on the verge of losing its biggest contract, a free trial of his system, and within 6 weeks their delivery times had improved so dramatically that the company avoided bankruptcy entirely. Word spread slowly through word of mouth, the kind of trust that cannot be bought with marketing budgets, only earned one saved business at a time. Eleanor introduced him to a small group of investors, hoping they might provide the capital he needed to expand faster. Instead, they offered him a deal that would have stripped him of control over his own company, in exchange for a modest sum of money, treating his idea as something to be acquired cheaply from a man they assumed had no other options. Caleb turned them down without hesitation, choosing slower, harder growth over losing the one thing he had built entirely on his own terms. Eleanor did not argue with his decision, she simply nodded, recognizing in him the same instinct for self-respect that had first caught her attention in that warehouse notebook. Word of Caleb's small but growing success eventually reached Jackson, who suddenly remembered their old friendship with renewed enthusiasm, now that there might be money involved. He reached out with warm messages about reconnecting, mentioning vaguely that he had contacts who could help Caleb raise real capital if he was interested. There was no mention of the years of silence that had passed between them, no acknowledgement of the night he had called, only to protect his own reputation, only the easy, practiced warmth of a man who had always been better at opening doors than walking through them honestly. Caleb responded politely, but kept his distance, agreeing to nothing more than a casual conversation, a caution he had not possessed 5 years earlier, when trust had come to him more easily and cost him more dearly. He had learned in the space between that humiliating dinner and this quiet office above a laundromat exactly how carefully loyalty needed to be measured before it was given away again. Eleanor, hearing about the exchange later, simply advised him to keep detailed records of anything Jackson said going forward, a piece of advice that would prove far more important than either of them yet realized. Jackson's renewed friendliness was not what it appeared to be. Over several casual meetings, he drew details out of Caleb about the mechanics of his logistics platform, framing his questions as the natural curiosity of someone trying to help find investors. Caleb, still cautious but wanting to believe old bonds could be repaired, shared more than he later wished he had. Jackson took what he learned straight to a competing logistics firm, selling the core structure of Caleb's model for a quiet payment that briefly solved his own mounting debts, never once considering what the betrayal would cost the man who had trusted him. The damage arrived within weeks. Caleb's company lost its largest contract to a rival firm that had suddenly, suspiciously, begun offering an almost identical service at a lower price. His small staff grew anxious, unsure whether the company would survive the loss, and Eleanor warned him plainly that he needed to prepare for a legal fight if he intended to protect what remained of his work. Caleb felt the betrayal less as a business setback and more as a wound to something personal, the particular ache of learning that a man he had once called a friend had sold him out for a fraction of what the friendship should have been worth. Amelia, still involved with Jackson at the time, took his side without hesitation when rumors of the dispute reached her. She had convinced herself that Jackson represented the future she wanted, and she was unwilling to entertain the idea that his success might be built on something rotten. When she ran into Caleb briefly at a mutual acquaintances gathering, she told him coldly that he should know his place, that people like him were not meant to compete in the world Jackson and men like him occupied, and that he would be wiser to accept defeat quietly rather than embarrass himself further. Caleb said nothing in response, the same silence he had offered her 5 years before, though this time the silence carried a different weight, less injury and more resolve. He did not fight back with accusations or public confrontation. Instead, he spent the following months gathering every piece of evidence he could find, quietly documenting the timeline of Jackson's betrayal while simultaneously redesigning his platform to be more advanced than anything the competing firm had stolen. There were nights during that stretch when he questioned whether the entire venture had been a mistake from the start, when the weight of nearly losing everything a second time pressed down harder than the original humiliation ever had. Eleanor reminded him, during one particularly difficult evening, that every serious business eventually faced a moment exactly like this one, a test that separated the people who quit from the people who simply refused to, and that the difference had nothing to do with talent and everything to do with persistence. He shifted his focus toward larger clients who valued substance over price, companies willing to pay for a system built with genuine expertise rather than a hastily copied imitation. It was, in many ways, the lowest point since that rainy night years earlier, and yet Caleb noticed something new in himself as he worked through it, a sharpness that had not existed before the betrayal, forged in the exact place where trust had failed him. The years that followed moved quickly, the way time often does once momentum finally takes hold after so long spent standing still. Caleb's small logistics platform grew steadily into a full technology company serving retail chains, hospitals, shipping carriers, and manufacturers across the country, its reputation built on the same quiet reliability that had once gone unnoticed in a warehouse break room. He became known in business circles as a chief executive who avoided headlines, who wore the same modest style of dress regardless of how much his company earned, and who made decisions with a calm decisiveness that unsettled competitors far more experienced than he was. Eleanor remained his closest advisor throughout the expansion, though their relationship had shifted over the years from mentor and student into something closer to equals who trusted each other completely. Caleb used the company's growing resources to acquire several struggling logistics firms, restructuring each one with the same patient discipline that had rebuilt his own life from nothing, turning failing operations into profitable divisions rather than stripping them for parts, the way many acquirers might have. He never spoke publicly about the humiliations that had shaped him, choosing instead to let the results of his work speak in a language no dinner table joke could ever undo. While Caleb's fortunes rose, Amelia's began to unravel in ways she had never anticipated. Jackson, it turned out, had built his entire persona on borrowed money and exaggerated connections, and when he steered Amelia into what he promised would be a lucrative private investment, the deal collapsed spectacularly, taking a significant portion of her savings with it. Her name became quietly associated with the failed venture among people who mattered in her industry, the kind of reputational damage that does not announce itself loudly, but instead closes doors one at a time without explanation. She lost her position at the investment firm not long after, let go under the polite language companies use when they want to distance themselves from anything resembling scandal. Friends who had once returned her calls within minutes now took days to respond, and invitations to the dinners and openings she had once treated as routine grew steadily rarer until they stopped coming altogether. The irony arrived slowly and then all at once, the understanding that the very wealth and status she had chased so single-mindedly, the standard by which she had once judged an honest man unworthy of her attention, had ultimately betrayed her far more completely than poverty ever could have. She spent long evenings alone in her apartment during those months, replaying decisions she had once been so certain of, wondering at what exact point the life she had built so carefully had become this fragile. Somewhere across the same city, in offices now spanning several floors of a glass tower, Caleb had become exactly the kind of powerful, self-made man Amelia had once declared she would only marry, without ever imagining he would be the one man she had already turned away. Amelia needed work urgently, her savings thinning, and her professional reputation still recovering from the failed investment that had cost her both money and standing. When a position opened at a major logistics and technology firm, known for its rigorous but fair hiring process, she applied without recognizing the name of the chief executive listed on the company's website, a name that had meant nothing to her when she had known him only as a quiet, struggling man at a birthday dinner 5 years earlier. She prepared for the interview the way she prepared for everything now, carefully, desperately, aware that her career could not survive another failure. The interview took place on the 40th floor of a glass tower downtown, in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the same lake she used to admire from restaurants she could no longer afford. Amelia sat rehearsing her answers in her mind, trying to project the confidence she no longer fully felt, aware that her file carried the quiet stain of the collapsed investment and the vague suspicion that clung to anyone associated with it. When the door finally opened, she looked up expecting an unfamiliar executive and instead found herself staring at a face she recognized instantly, older now, composed in a dark tailored suit, unmistakably the same man she had once dismissed without a second thought. For a long moment Amelia could not speak. The room seemed to tilt slightly around her as 5 years of memory collapsed into a single unbearable recognition, the understanding that the man she had humiliated over dinner was now the person holding her professional future in his hands. Caleb did not acknowledge the past directly. He greeted her with the same measured professional courtesy he extended to every candidate, took his seat across the table, and began asking questions about her work history, her understanding of ethical leadership, and how she evaluated the character of the people she worked alongside. Each question, though phrased with complete professionalism, seemed to circle closer and closer to the exact failures that had defined the last 5 years of her life. He asked how she decided who deserved trust and who did not, how she handled situations where loyalty and self-interest came into conflict, and what she believed a person truly owed to someone who had once been unfairly judged. Amelia answered as honestly as she could manage, feeling with each response the uncomfortable clarity of a woman confronting, in real time, every assumption that had once shaped her cruelty, aware that the man across the table already knew every answer better than she did. Somewhere in the middle of the interview, she considered simply acknowledging the past outright, saying his name and the memory both carried, but something in his composed, unreadable expression told her the moment for that conversation had not yet arrived, that he intended to let the professional process run its course before anything personal was addressed. By the time the interview ended, she left the glass tower unsure whether she had just secured a future or witnessed the quiet, patient beginning of a reckoning 5 years in the making. Word traveled fast through the small circles of Chicago's business world, and it did not take Jackson long to learn that Amelia had interviewed at Caleb's company. He reached out to her within days, his old warmth resurfacing with the same practiced ease he had always used to draw people toward whatever scheme currently served him best. He framed his offer as a favor between old friends, suggesting that if Amelia could gather certain internal information from her new position, information about upcoming contracts and pending acquisitions, he could arrange a lucrative opportunity that would finally repair the reputation their failed investment had damaged. Amelia found herself at a genuine crossroads, torn between two versions of the life she might still choose. Part of her, shaped by years of fear and old habits, wondered whether one quiet compromise might be worth the security it promised, a return to the kind of comfort she had spent her whole life chasing. But another part of her, newer and less certain of itself, recoiled at the thought of betraying the very company that represented her only real chance at rebuilding something honest after years of chasing illusions that had ultimately cost her everything she once valued. Caleb, through contacts within his own legal and security teams, had already caught wind of Jackson's approach before Amelia ever mentioned it to anyone. He recognized the pattern immediately, the same manipulative instinct that had once cost him a major contract years earlier, and he chose deliberately not to intervene right away. He wanted more than anything to see what Amelia would choose to do, now that the glittering promises that once defined her life no longer had anywhere solid left to stand. Now that the choice in front of her was no longer about appearances, but about who she actually was underneath them. After several sleepless nights, Amelia refused Jackson's offer outright, telling him plainly that she was done building her life on borrowed shortcuts and second-hand schemes. Jackson pushed back, reminding her of everything she stood to lose: the security, the comfortable re-entry into a world she had worked so hard to belong to. But for once his familiar arguments failed to move her the way they once had. Something in her had shifted quietly over the preceding weeks, watching Caleb lead with a steadiness that made Jackson's constant scheming look smaller and more desperate by comparison. She then made the harder choice, walking into the company's legal department and quietly reporting the full details of what Jackson had proposed, aware that doing so might cost her the very job she desperately needed if anyone doubted her motives. Her hands trembled slightly as she recounted the conversation to the company's counsel, uncertain whether honesty would be believed or simply used as further evidence against her. It was not a decision that erased her past mistakes, but it marked, for the first time in longer than she cared to admit, a choice made not out of fear or ambition, but out of something closer to genuine integrity. Caleb called an emergency meeting once Amelia's report reached his desk, gathering his executive team, the company's legal counsel, Amelia, and Jackson himself into a single conference room on the top floor. Jackson arrived confident, assuming he still held enough leverage to twist the situation in his favor, immediately attempting to shift blame onto Amelia and deny any wrongdoing before anyone had even finished explaining why the meeting had been called. His voice carried the same easy charm it always had, though this time it landed against an audience that already knew far more than he assumed. Caleb allowed him to speak first, then calmly laid out a folder of evidence across the table: old emails, financial records, and documentation, tracing Jackson's betrayal all the way back to the theft of Caleb's original business model 5 years earlier. It became clear in that moment that Caleb had known about Jackson's actions long before this meeting, that he had spent years quietly gathering proof rather than confronting him prematurely, waiting patiently for the exact moment when the evidence would be undeniable and the consequences unavoidable. Amelia sat frozen as the full picture assembled itself in front of her, realizing for the first time that Jackson had not only destroyed Caleb's early company, but had also used her, both years ago and again just recently, as a tool whenever it served his own advancement. The betrayal she had once dismissed as none of her concern had, in fact, shaped the entire trajectory of her adult life without her ever fully understanding it. Caleb did not gloat or raise his voice as the truth settled over the room. He simply stated, evenly, that real power was never about the size of a bank account, but about whether a person could hold on to their character when they had every opportunity and justification to abandon it. Jackson was escorted from the building that same afternoon, facing the beginning of a legal process that would follow him for years to come, his reputation collapsing far faster than it had ever been built. He tried on his way out to appeal to Amelia one last time, reminding her of the years they had spent together, but she said nothing, watching him go the way Caleb had once watched a room full of laughter fade behind a closing door. Before the meeting ended, Amelia stood, her voice unsteady but clear, and offered Caleb a formal apology in front of the entire room, acknowledging not only the cruelty of that dinner 5 years earlier, but the years of judgment and assumption that had followed it. She did not ask for forgiveness, only acknowledged aloud what she now understood clearly, that the man she had once dismissed as beneath her had spent 5 years quietly becoming everything she claimed to want, while she had spent those same years chasing its shadow. Caleb listened without interrupting, his expression giving away nothing of what the moment cost him internally, the quiet culmination of 5 years spent proving, without ever needing to say it aloud, exactly who he really was. In the days following the meeting, most of Caleb's executive team assumed Amelia's employment would end quietly, that her history with Jackson and the shadow of the earlier scandal made her continued presence at the company impossible to justify. Amelia herself expected nothing less, already mentally preparing to gather her belongings and accept that this chapter, like so many others, would close on terms she did not get to choose. She had come to the interview searching for a paycheck and instead found herself face to face with the exact consequences of a life spent measuring worth by the wrong currency. Caleb called her into his office alone, without lawyers or witnesses, and told her plainly that he was not offering her a position out of pity, and certainly not out of any desire for revenge dressed up as generosity. He explained that he was willing to offer her a role, though not the one she had originally applied for, a position several levels below her previous experience within a newly created division focused on rebuilding ethical standards and accountability across the company's culture. The offer came with clear conditions: no shortcuts based on her prior title, no special treatment because of who she once knew, and complete transparency about the mistakes of her past whenever they became relevant to her work. Amelia accepted without hesitation, understanding immediately that this was not a reward disguised as mercy, but an actual opportunity to rebuild something real, brick by difficult brick, in the same patient way Caleb himself had once rebuilt his entire life from a warehouse night shift and a second-hand notebook. She cleared out the small desk assigned to her new role without complaint, aware that colleagues who once might have reported to someone at her old level now stood above her, and she did the work anyway, quietly and without excuse. Caleb maintained a careful professional distance as she began the role, neither cold nor overly familiar, demonstrating through his conduct that he had genuinely moved beyond the pain of the past rather than simply burying it beneath the appearance of forgiveness. He checked on her progress only through the same reporting lines he used for every other employee, refusing to let old history grant her either extra scrutiny or extra sympathy, a fairness that surprised her more than outright coldness would have. The story deliberately avoided the easy comfort of instant redemption, the kind where old wounds vanish the moment an apology is spoken aloud. Caleb's restraint reflected something harder and more honest than forgiveness offered too quickly, a recognition that trust, once broken as thoroughly as his had been, could only be rebuilt slowly, through consistent action rather than a single well-timed conversation. For Amelia, the lower position, the stripped title, and the lack of any guaranteed second chance became, unexpectedly, the first entirely honest opportunity she had encountered in years, one she would either rise to meet or fail on the strength of her own effort alone. A year passed, and the change in Amelia became impossible for anyone who knew her to overlook. She no longer measured people by the size of their paycheck or the label on their coat, having learned the hard way that appearances collapse far more easily than character does. Working within the company's new ethics and accountability division, she helped design a fairer hiring process specifically intended to give a real chance to people who might otherwise be dismissed because of their background, their appearance, or their lack of conventional credentials, the very kind of dismissal she herself had once inflicted on someone else without a second thought. Caleb remained the company's chief executive throughout that year, as decisive and disciplined as ever, though those who worked closely with him noticed a quiet humanity in how he led, an insistence on second chances for employees who showed genuine effort even when their pasts were complicated. At a company gathering marking the anniversary of the division Amelia now helped run, Amelia watched him step onto a small stage, dressed simply, speaking not about wealth or success but about dignity, patience, and the quiet cost of being underestimated by people who never bothered to look closely enough to see the truth. Standing near the back of the room, Amelia found herself remembering the exact words she had once spoken at that dinner years earlier, and for the first time she understood them fully, not merely as cruelty, but as a symptom of a much deeper emptiness she had carried since childhood, one she had spent years trying to fill with the wrong things entirely. Poverty, she realized now, watching the man she had once mocked speak with such steady conviction, had never been the thing worth fearing. It was the hollowness of chasing appearances instead of substance that had nearly cost her everything that actually mattered in the end. Later that evening, Caleb and Amelia spoke privately for the first time in months. A brief conversation marked not by romance or dramatic reconciliation, but by something quieter and more durable, a kind of mutual respect neither of them had expected to find on the other side of so much history. She asked him, finally, whether he had ever truly forgiven her, and he answered honestly that forgiveness had come slowly and in pieces, not delivered all at once, but earned gradually through a year of watching her choose honesty over comfort again and again, when nobody would have blamed her for choosing otherwise. Caleb told her plainly that the past could not be erased, only carried forward differently, and that the true measure of a person was not the mistake they once made, but whether they chose, deliberately and repeatedly, not to repeat it. Amelia did not walk away that evening having won back a wealthy man's affection, and she did not need to. She had recovered something far more valuable than that, her own character, while Caleb needed no revenge at all, because the empire he had built quietly, patiently on his own terms, had already answered every question that dinner table years ago had ever tried to ask. In the end, this was never a story about a poor man chasing wealth to prove a point, nor about a woman punished simply for wanting more out of life. It was about the quiet difference between chasing the appearance of value and actually building it, one honest decision at a time, even when nobody is watching and nobody seems to care. Caleb never set out to make Amelia regret her words. He simply refused to let them define him, choosing instead to answer humiliation with patience and betrayal with discipline. Amelia's real victory was not the job she nearly lost, but the honesty she finally chose to live by. If this story moved you, carry its simplest lesson forward: that character, not currency, is the truest measure of any person's worth.